Well, sure enough, when I tried to pause the thing, I lost. I was not able to continue recording, so I'll continue on the little roll I was on, talking about Jesus as one of the Jews who expected God to intervene at the end of history, when the time of tribulation was over, when the appointed time came, when Malachi's prophecies would be fulfilled. At the end of days, these things would happen, etc. And I think that the clearest indication of that to begin with is his being a disciple, probably of John the Baptist, who expected an intervention by God, pretty much along the lines of Malachi, where God is sending Elijah, the Lord, Ha'adon, not Yahweh in this case, but using the word the Lord will suddenly come to his temple. He'll purify the sons of Levi, etc. He'll come like a burning oven, and there will be judgment. And this is exactly what John the Baptist is preaching, especially in Matthew 3 and Luke 3 and in Mark 1. The end of time is coming. And Jesus, according to Schweitzer, uh, believed that he would be instrumental, that he would be that he was the Son of Man, or perhaps would return as the Son of Man and inaugurate this eschatological era of salvation, judgment, retribution for the wicked. I haven't read enough of Schweitzer except through the biographer that I was mentioning, James Brabazon, to know what he thought about resurrection or judgment as far as Jesus's expectations. If you were to follow Daniel, at the end of time, there is a resurrection. Chapter 12 of Daniel, you have a resurrection of many, which I stick to the actual word rabim, which is a very common word in this kind of literature at the end of the second, or towards the end of the Second Temple period. In case of Daniel, around 165 BCE. And the many are composed of the very good, who will rise to eternal life and will shine like the stars, or at least the maskilim, the teachers who made many righteous or justified many, etc. They will shine like the stars of the firmament. And then the very evil will also rise for judgment, and they will suffer eternal dera'an, which is a word only found at the end of Isaiah, very horrible type of shame, etc. So, but let's look at a text that I find to be the snapshot of what Schweitzer has to say about Jesus. And it is that, well, first of all, that Jesus was mistaken and the kingdom did not come. He preached it, he healed, he held these communal meals that included the outcasts. He's ingathering Israel. The 12 disciples indicate that. The joining of the two kingdoms, the north and the south, is already in Ezekiel 37, etc. Jesus is manifesting all these signs of the end time. That's what the Gospels recount. When John the Baptist sends disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another?" Jesus replies to tell John the Baptist all the healings and messianic signs from Isaiah 34, 35, etc., that were expected. He's doing them. So he's the Messiah. But this cannot be revealed, or he really won't be the Messiah until he triumphs. This was a common Jewish idea that no one named himself Messiah. Someone was manifested to be the Messiah when God would uh, have you triumph. The most, I think, but with Bar Kokhba, the leader of the Jewish revolt in 132 CE, he was called Hanazi, a lifted up one, just like in Ezekiel 34, they talk about someone who is lifted up. And it's something that God has to do, and Jesus expected this to be done, and he to be an essential part of, or an instrument of this salvation or final redemption happening. And apparently, it's not working. And Schweitzer, I'm going to read this page from Brabazon's biography. Jesus' death changed everything, but not in the way that Jesus intended. Jesus and his disciples expected the kingdom of God in the eschatological sense, the sense of the end of the world as we know it, with the creation of a new world with glorified bodies or something. N.T. Wright has a lot on that. The spiritual understanding of the kingdom of God is within you, as Luke says, was forced on the church by the failure of the eschatological kingdom to arrive. The church had to interpret and misinterpret, writes Babazon. He's got a big interest in this. The belated records of Jesus' sayings. So Brabazon, following Schweitzer, which I have not read. I've read his psychiatric study of Jesus, but I haven't read much of his historical Jesus. But I'm familiar with historical Jesus stuff. The belated records means that he thinks only the Gospel of Mark may contain authentic information about Jesus. I did my doctoral dissertation on the so-called cleansing of the temple in Mark, and I have a lot of videos on that and on Mark in general, around 70 videos. Nothing historical in John, according to these people, whereas John actually has some real historical tidbits. But the important thing is that the church has to deal with this delay of the parousia, the delay of Jesus coming in triumph on the clouds, like the Son of Man on the clouds in Daniel 7. And the church had to make fit in with a future, these expectations that Jesus never envisaged. Jesus never envisaged a church lasting 2,000 years and spiritual kingdom, and the world doesn't really change much, but you change inside perhaps, and then maybe afterwards you're going to have the second coming. We're still waiting for that. Second letter of Peter, probably the latest in the New Testament, says that it's God's patience that is making us that is giving us the opportunity to repent. But such was the immense ethical and religious power of Jesus' personality that it did now become possible for those who followed him to live in a totally new way, to live in fact in a kingdom within the world that, again, Jesus himself never envisaged. Jesus never thought that he left some teaching so that people could follow them for thousands of years, without ever having this new world emerge. The Christian view of the world, which he founded by his death, carries mankind forever beyond eschatology. So I think with Brabazon, this is Schweitzer, he's quoting Schweitzer. You no longer have to wait for this miracle of a second coming or the new world, but rather you start living the kingdom yourself here. You start trying to build it because of the power of Jesus's personality and ethics. I'm going to try to talk about this. If I can't get to it today, it'll be some other session. And I'll deal with that in a second. The power of Jesus' personality, not so much the power of Jesus by sending the Holy Spirit or God, working with us for our salvation, or I can do all things in him who empowers me of Philippians, etc. We must not, says Schweitzer, impose these later ideas onto the historical Jesus. That is where untruth starts, because we all begin to saddle Jesus with the outlook and ideas of our own time and place. If we allow Jesus to remain in every way a man of his time, conditioned by the beliefs prevalent in his place in history, we can then see how superhuman his personality really was. Let me pause a second. I did read the psychiatric study of Jesus, Einstein. Everybody confuses Schweitzer with Einstein. They both are Alberts, and they knew each other and liked each other and corresponded. But Schweitzer, and I haven't gotten to this yet, actually after those two doctorates that I mentioned in my prior talk, Doctor of Philosophy, specializing in Kant, Doctor of Theology, I think specializing in the historical Jesus, he made a resolution. I will wait till I am 30. He was born in 1875. I will wait till I am 30 to finish my studies, and then I will devote my incredible energy and intelligence and brilliance and genius to helping mankind. And he does that by studying medicine at the age of 30 something. Studies a third doctorate so that he can then go to Africa, as is well known, to one of the poorest places in Africa. And I keep having senior moments. It's called Go. It's in the sort of the French Congo. It became German and then back to France, I think, where he was. Gabon, Lambaréné, maybe in French is the way it's pronounced. But imagine that, studying medicine after you have not only two doctorates, but tremendous possibilities as a professor, tremendous possibilities as an expert in music, an author on Bach, an expert on how Bach played the organ and how it should be played and how organs should be made and how they should, where the acoustics should be and all this kind of stuff. He could be both in the religious field or even philosophical field or musical field. He decides to go to this place in Africa, and I'm looking at this Wikipedia article. Here's his grave marked by a cross he made himself. But getting back to this impact of Jesus, and we want to try to explore that. And again, if I can't finish today, there'll be a third session. The first one should have been this one because I was not able to pause myself after 12 minutes, and I didn't want to throw away 12 minutes when I had gotten more, into it. So that he says that Jesus's death, and we're going to explore how, does away with this eschatology where you're waiting for a future miraculous intervention, sensational intervention of God, or even Jesus coming on the clouds to judge the living and the dead and to gather the elect, etc. So we can't impose what the church did with the disillusionment, says Schweitzer, of that Jesus never triumphed or never came back on the clouds. Paul in First Thessalonians apparently thinks he's going to be alive when Jesus comes back and is trying to console those who already died and saying, you're not disadvantaged, or your relatives who have died are not in a disadvantage. They will rise first and then we'll meet the Lord in the air, etc. in First Thessalonians. So that he says that untruth begins when we begin to attribute to Jesus the kinds of sort of rationalizations and spiritualizations that the churches made up to deal with this disappointment that Jesus' plan didn't work out. He didn't triumph as Messiah. He didn't defeat the enemies of Israel, as Psalm 2 would say. He will crush the heads of the enemies, the Messiah will, etc. But he says that if we allow Jesus to remain a man of his time, which again, I was talking about the psychiatric study of Jesus, he says you can't call him nuts because that's what a lot of Jews believed in his time. The only thing that distinguishes Jesus is the role he attributed to himself. I'm the one. I'm the instrument of this end of time, end of the present age, the inauguration of the age to come. I am the Son of Man who will be given all this power and glory, etc., as Daniel 7 says, verse 13, etc. All the nations will worship, etc. Well, you could be, maybe a paranoid schizophrenic and believe that you're that great. But Schweitzer refutes all that, having studied a lot of psychiatry in his little book. At least the version I read in English is a little book by translated by a Unitarian who loves this stuff, anti-Trinitarian stuff, etc. And he basically, I think, tries to proves that Jesus shows no signs of mental illness. He's working within the worldview of his people and time, but does attribute to himself a role, which now I think Schweitzer will discuss in this brief snapshot. If we consider all that, we can then see how superhuman his personality really was. Why? Because his spirit was such, Jesus' spirit was such, that he attempted to bring history to an end. The most heroic act, and I think Schweitzer loved heroism, that anyone of his time could conceive of. Schweitzer uses a marvelous image in the quest of the historical Jesus, in the knowledge, writes Schweitzer, that he, Jesus, is the coming Son of Man. Jesus lays hold of the wheel of the world to set it moving on that last revolution, turning of the wheel, which is to bring all ordinary history to a close. So Jesus says, I'm going to bring this history to a close. I'm going to grab this wheel of history and turn it. It refuses to turn this wheel of history, and he throws himself upon it. Then it does turn and crushes him. instead of bringing in the eschatological conditions, he has destroyed them. The wheel rolls onward, and the mangled body of the one is very unusual. The one immeasurably great man who was strong enough to think of himself as the spiritual ruler of mankind and to bend history to his purpose is hanging upon it still. So Jesus' body is still hanging on this wheel of history, which he has attempted to turn and actually forces it to turn in some way. Uh, and his victory is that he was strong enough, says Schweitzer, to think of himself as a spiritual ruler of mankind and to bend history to his purpose. And that is his victory and his reign. I'm not sure I understand that 100%. But what I interpret that to mean is this, that Jesus, and I think this is in line with biblical and New Testament theology, like the letter to the Hebrews, he presented his body in obedience to God. Jesus said, I will voluntarily give myself over to this most awful death and see what happens. I trust that God will deliver me. I'm kind of using my own interpretation here. And what I will have done by voluntarily being crucified, because he could have escaped, I think historians agree that Jesus could have found ways to avoid crucifixion if he had wanted to. What I will do will be such a triumph of my will or spirit of obedience or love for others, in that I am sacrificing myself. I am being an example of being true to my mission, even when the mission seems to have failed. I believe it's a divine mission. I have to trust in God that somehow it will issue in victory. I'm kind of interpreting it my way. And that his example was so potent that I think that's what made Schweitzer say, we have to follow Jesus. He's the master. He's the model. He has authority. He's the ethical authority. No one has ever overcome selfishness and narrow-mindedness and unbelief, if you will, more than Jesus. So whether he's coming back or not, whether he rose from the dead or not, whether he was really the Son of Man or not, of Daniel, or expected by Enoch, etc., as Messiah and chosen one, etc., for reasons that are still unclear to me, and I just got the autobiography. I ordered the autobiography of Schweitzer. And I can read a lot more stuff, I suppose, I'm sure. But it was enough, and this is what I'm interested in to begin to finish this. It was enough to make Schweitzer say, regardless of doctrines and dogmas and beliefs, which may be fairy tales, I'm kind of paraphrasing maybe Schweitzer, what Jesus did, what he represented, his commensality, his eating together with sinners and outcasts, healing lepers, going to the outcasts, saying, whatever you did to the least of my brethren, you did to me. This compassion, and Schweitzer does arrive very close, or really right at, the Buddhist idea of compassion more than almost any Christian idea in this regard. Alleviate suffering. His first great lemma, if you will, saying, motto, was reverence for life, which means really a great respect for all life, including animal and insect life, which should only be killed in case of great necessity. But then after World War I, if I recall correctly, he got an abscess in the anal area, which was operated on and then needed a second operation. And he suffered quite a bit. And so he developed a subsidiary, if you will, corollary of this reverence for life thing. And I'm going to read it. This is where my index can come in handy. Sometimes it needs more work. He talks about the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain. Who are the members of this fellowship? Those who have learned by experience what physical pain and bodily anguish mean. Belong together all the world over, they are united by a secret bond. One and all, they know the horrors of suffering to which man can be exposed, and one and all, they know the longing to be free from pain. He who has been delivered from pain must not think he is now free again and at liberty to take up his life just as it was before, entirely forgetful of the past. He is now a man whose eyes are open, almost like the Buddha, with regard to pain and anguish, and he must help to overcome those two enemies, pain and anguish, so far as human power can control them, and to bring to others the deliverance which he himself enjoyed. Now, before I forget, because there's other things that I could say, Schweitzer conceived of Africa as a place that the white man had made to suffer. And he saw his going to Africa literally in terms of expiation, totally cultic, Old Testament, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement type of concept, just like the death of Christ. Expiation. You try to undo the sins of others by loving the victims of those sins of exploitation and oppression, etc. And he also had seen this statue in his own town, which later was, I think, destroyed, of a tremendous black man, muscular, beautiful sculpture. And he was fascinated by that image of this black African in his hometown. So what he does, he doesn't try to copy Jesus, carry a cross across the United States or something. He studies medicine and chooses one of the poorest, most out of the way places, one of the most backward places in this Gabon area, where he lives in this extreme heat, has to administer this little hospital he slowly builds. Later in 40s and later, and even before, he starts getting more and more donations, but he refuses to make it an industry where people take over the hospital and they build a big building and then they provide the food. He wants to stay with African customs in that area where if a person is sick, the whole family comes and moves in to the place of treatment and cook for him, for the sick person, because there's fear of poisoning between tribes or clans or whatever groups, non-family groups. There's all kinds of this backwardness, you'd have to call it. And little by little, he got a refrigerator and maybe a little motorboat and things of that sort. But basically, he kept it very, very sort of primitive, and according to as much as possible, the ethos and customs of the area. A British writer put him down quite a bit for that, saying, "This is all about you, Schweitzer. You want to be a big hero. And what you've done in terms of effect, how many people you've really cured and how much really have you changed anything, is minimal. In fact, you've probably done more harm than good because you've interfered with modernization, etc." It reminds you of Mother Teresa, who was told, what you're doing is a drop in the ocean. You're doing nothing to alleviate all the problems. We should be working with committees and great funds to try to improve things at a massive scale. No, Schweitzer believed in the individual and this following the kingdom or building up the kingdom as an individual in communion with others, but not selling your soul, so to speak, to the big money or the big publicity or the big enterprises or the big projects that lose that personal, person-to-person touch. And it is true, I think, that Schweitzer was led by this desire for heroism, this feeling that he had been incredibly loved and had received incredible gifts in education, in family love, in experiences, etc., with great musicians, etc. And he wanted not only to pay it back or forward or whatever you want to call it, but to do it in an isolated place. He repeatedly praises what solitude, how necessary solitude is. He liked to play his little piano. He liked to write. He liked to think. Whether Brabazon rightly or wrongly fails to mention, doesn't mention prayer, but it must have been a lot of meditation, if not actual prayer. And you can look up a lot of stuff on Schweitzer. There's a great documentary on YouTube by Erica Anderson, 2 hours, with Schweitzer himself, narrated by Frederick March, the great actor. Actually, narrated by Burgess Meredith, and the voice of Schweitzer is Frederick March. So to conclude this, what is striking to me at this time, and I may go on some other time with more thoughts that I may get by reading more, thinking more, or something. But it sounds to me like a very stubborn, rational, well-trained, Germanic type of guy with the French elan or whatever you want to, looked at Jesus in a very hard-nosed way, decided to do away with all the pie in the sky or fairy tale type stuff. I'm using kind of the words that he might characterize his thoughts. I may be misstating, but that's what I'm stating. And said the essence is Jesus has moral authority. Jesus is the master. Jesus is the model. He's the one immeasurably great man. He tried to do something super heroic. perhaps under tremendous delusions, as it turned out to be, not psychological delusions primarily, although maybe that too, but delusions of Jewish apocalyptic, which has basically been rejected by the rabbis. They said, forget about this Son of Man on the clouds thing. Akiva, I think turnips will grow on your beard before the Messiah comes, they told the great Rabbi Akiva. The Jews are very realistic about do things in this world, repair the world, tikkun olam, and don't dream about some guy in clouds coming and saving you, being very blunt about that. So this Schweitzer said, but what Jesus stands for, what his life was, as much as we can gather from a historical scrutiny of what is history in maybe one gospel, because the others are either derivative or make up a lot of stuff. We have to follow that example. We may or may not be judged the final day on that, but that is our calling. I don't know that he develops a whole metaphysics or a whole anthropology that that Jesus, we work with Jesus in his body to fight against evil or something. But again, I confess that I am not too clear, and I don't know that he gave a lot of thought to it, except to say, I must do what Jesus commanded. Feed the least of these, heal the least of these, carry the cross, go to a forgotten place. Whether it's going to be the most effective change or not, the example might lead many others to multiply these acts of, not only acts of kindness, but lives of kindness, and repair the world, to put it in Jewish terms, or show compassion in a much more active way than the Buddhists, because I think Schweitzer recognizes, or at least says, that Hinduism and Buddhism are more passive than Christianity or Judaism. I don't know whether he would say Judaism is more inner concerned and Christ and Christianity is more centrifugal, more to the outward islands, as second Isaiah says. The ends of the world will see the salvation, my salvation. Yeshuati says, Isaiah 49, will see my Jesus or my salvation. Certainly, this is all ecumenical in the sense not just of within Christian churches, but the whole ecumene, the whole universe or inhabited world or something, has to be affected by our kindness and repair. And he was against nuclear war. He got into the nuclear war debate, studied it completely, etc. And so it's a remarkable life, tremendous energy that his wife couldn't match. He married Hélène. I want to say something about her because that's what I'm reading about now. I haven't finished the book yet, this biography by Brabazon. But Hélène, of Jewish ancestry, a very bright and tremendous woman, but whose health did not match. So she went back to Africa and died shortly. I mean, she went to Africa various times and spent some good periods there, but when she went back to Europe, she died very quickly thereafter, her last trip. The marriage was not, your typical head over heels in love thing. It was a partnership of like-minded, let's call them idealists. Schweitzer, for all his broad-mindedness, was kind of a prude in sexual matters, incredibly frugal. Many of his manuscripts have to be pieced together from envelopes and maybe grocery bags or just pieces of photocopies or copies of bills, etc. Any scrap of paper. His clothes were 40, 50 years old. complete kenosis, we would say in Christian theological terms. He emptied himself just like Christ, and just like the servant in Isaiah 53, the same Hebrew verb is going to be used of pouring out what's inside a glass. So it's an incredible, incredible story of a real man that died in 1965. I was in elementary, almost out of elementary school. And I wanted to share these thoughts about him and tie them into theological or Christological or New Testament ideas, which I probably will want to explain why, in fact, take advantage of my ignorance, if that's what it is. I think it is ignorance of how Schweitzer put together the dots, connected the dots in all these things, and try to discuss why Jesus has this power, or try to articulate it a bit more, and try to tie it into what made Schweitzer do something which, if you disregard expediency and great success, he fed millions, and even Andres, the chef, who's a great guy. It's a great sign. All people that do that stuff to me are repairers of the world. But some do it on a major scale, Bill Gates or something, whatever, whether you agree with everything or not about him. I like him and I support him quite a bit, as far as I know. Nevertheless, the story of this man, and I'm interested in biographies, and I read a lot of them. The story of this man is inspiring, and it has to do with the story of Jesus. And I wanted to share these thoughts with you.